And if you want to follow along with us this morning, we're in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is right after Psalms and Proverbs, kind of in the middle of the Bible there. So let me pray and get us going in the Word here. Father, we're about to open your Word in this most unique of books in the Bible, book of Ecclesiastes, where Solomon speaks from different perspectives about reality, and somewhere we fall into that perspective, Father, and we want to have yours. We want to have the perspective that you have, and Solomon's leading us there, but today he's in another part of the world, another worldview. So we ask you to help us grasp what he's doing in Christ's name. Amen. So if the book of Ecclesiastes were like a foot race, in a large stadium, we would be sort of rounding the last corner there and heading towards this straight end, and you can kind of see the distance. So we're getting close to the end, but we're not there yet. It's kind of a dark corner, this turn of the last way around to the straight way, but Solomon has provided us a bold and honest look at the realities of the world, and that's what he's doing still here in this section. So he's my kind of guy. He likes to take on the big questions, that we all should have if we bother to think about things at all. So those are the real questions. Philosophers are supposed to do that, and down through the ages they've kind of did that, but modern philosophy doesn't do that very much anymore. It's kind of steeped in linguistic analysis and science and relativism, and modern philosophy doesn't really address human beings, as men anymore. It doesn't really even deal with those questions because it treats us as biological creatures only. We're biological entities. And we know we're more than that, but in our hearts we know we're more than that. But that's kind of where they are, so they've kind of drifted away from all the big questions, So modern philosophy has almost no interest in the soul, or even the idea of the soul, the immaterial part of you. The you that makes you you is the way I like to call it, that thing that is more than biology, that makes you an individual person. But mostly modern philosophy follows science and denies the existence of a soul altogether. So Solomon looked at that denial too in his own day, and as we've seen throughout the book, when he was young, he took that view of the world out for a walk, if you will. That was kind of what he accepted. That's what he tried to live by. So he sort of tried it out, but ultimately he found it incredibly inadequate. And I like Solomon. He doesn't ignore, he doesn't dance around difficult questions. He goes at them face on, and he even adopts them to see if they're going to work or not, that kind of an idea. So he just looks at them squarely. So last week, Solomon forced us to contemplate the great mystery of all, which is death. And remember, he looks at everything in this book is looked at from two different vantage points. So if you've been with us, you know that, but let me just kind of walk you through that real quick. Again, there's two voices he speaks with. Sometimes he speaks with the voice of his younger self, the philosophical voice, when he sought to grasp what the good life is according to the standards of the philosophers of his day, ancient Near Eastern wise men, the philosophers of his day. Essentially, they were materialists. It's not that they didn't have any religion, but they didn't think that mattered about the big questions. So they were just looking for, how do you live a good life? And they come up with their philosophical ideas and suggestions for that, and they were laboring for that. Solomon was the wisest man of his day, and they came to him to hear him speak. So they listened to what he had to say, and at that time he was speaking in their language. And their language is, we can only know truth, by observation. We can only know what's real by something that can be measured. That's the modern view as well, materialistic view. If you can't measure it, it isn't real. It's like your soul. You can't see it, right? You can't weigh it or anything like that. So we only know things by observation. And he calls this thinking under the sun. Under the sun. So if you look at under the sun passages in Ecclesiastes, he's talking from that point of view, the materialist point of view. This world is all there is. There's no supernatural realm. There's no spirit. There's no soul. That kind of an idea. He knows from experience and reason that under the sun view of things ends up with emptiness. That's why the book begins the way it does. Vanity of vanity. Vanity is a word for emptiness. So that's what he's talking about. That ends up empty. He calls it striving after wind, like you're trying to catch the wind. and that kind of an idea. So, but that voice is the voice of the people he's trying to reach. So he wants to bring the wise men that are coming to him for wisdom to the Lord. So first he's talking about the logical conclusion of the under the sun thinking. And then when you're in despair because of the logical conclusion of it, he's going to bring in the Lord. So today we're still in the under the sun section. So there's 4 parts to this, and each time he starts there empty, and then he brings in the Lord. And he's going to do that again in this last section we're in of the book here. So, but today we're in the under the sun part. So he's got that worldview. Now, in other places, all along in each of the sections, he'll eventually get to the other worldview, the other voice that he speaks with, the voice that knows God, that knows there's a creator, that knows there's a judge of the universe. He knows God because God revealed himself as the creator in the creation, and as the creator, he has communicated his will to this world, both by law, and in Solomon's case, it would be the law of Moses that he knows, and also conscience. We all have a conscience that tells us about right and wrong. So in Solomon's case, now he had heard from God directly. So a couple of times. So, but he doesn't use that because that's kind of unfair because these are people he's talking to God might not speak to directly, right? So he's not using that. He's taking them first to the logical conclusion of under the sun thinking, and then he's going to bring in what we know about God. That's from broad revelation there. So he wants something universal that they'll all be able to accept. So he can't rely on, God told me this, that if I said that God told me this, you'd probably go, yeah, well, he didn't tell me. So, but he has spoken in ways that are determinative, prophetic ways in the Bible, but he's not doing that. He's breaking them on their own philosophy first, and then bringing in the reality of who God is, who can be seen in creation, and there are human nature too. We're all reflections of God. We're made in his image. So he's using all of that kind of thinking. So he wants them to see that God makes sense of things that modern philosophy barely knows how to even talk about anymore. It used to be truth, beauty, goodness, Plato and all those guys, justice, love, matters of the soul. And Solomon turned to God because under the sun, philosophy has so few answers about any of that stuff, as modern philosophy has so few answers about all that kind of a stuff. Also, modern philosophy and that ancient philosophy under the sun does not match the longings of the human heart. We can tell partly what's real from what we long for. Because when you long for something, it actually exists. When you long for food, it's there. When you long for companionship, it's there. I mean, it's there in a general sense. God created a world that has that. If you long for eternal life, you know why you do? Because it's actually there. So these are aspects that God has placed in the human heart. Earlier in the book, he said God has placed eternity in our hearts. And that's true. That's why we long for that. So, now the ancient philosophers were looking for truth that would be useful. The good life, the life well lived. And they would observe life and draw principles that they could apply to life. So Solomon finds those principles useful too. Useful, but flawed. Why are they flawed? Because they're so limited. So these ancient wise men were looking for useful things, and Solomon said, yes, those are useful things, and I can offer you more useful things. I've got more things that are wise, the way to live, a good way to live versus a bad way to live. So Solomon finds those principles useful, but he finds them extremely limited. The big problem is trying to find the good life by observation only. You can learn things about life by observation, but not the big things, not the most important things. You can establish principles that are helpful through observation, but you can't find certainty through observation. That's a really important idea, so hang on to that as we're going through this here. So, I was thinking of a really good example of a modern ancient Near Eastern wise man. In other words, a man that thought like that, who was genuinely wise and genuinely had good things to share, but was not a believer, and he's under the sun. He's got under the sun thinking, and I had a really hard time thinking of it, but then a name came to my mind, and somebody I do listen to and I pay attention to. His name is Jonathan Haidt. Not Haidt like this, but H-A-I-D-T, okay? And he's just a really interesting guy. Have you ever heard of him? You should. He actually has a website where his ideas and people like him bring in their ideas, and it's really interesting because it's called After Babel. Now, this guy's not a believer, But it's just really interesting that he calls his website after Babel. You know, Babel's where all the confusion of the languages happened, right? So in Solomon's day, a guy like Jonathan Haidt would be a model ancient Near Eastern wise man. So he asks questions like, what helps human beings flourish? What hinders flourishing? What is wise for them to practice? What should they avoid? And like I said, he's not a Christian. He's not very religious at all. I don't think he believes in God, but if he does, it's very vague. But he has some really excellent advice. So this Jonathan Haidt guy is a social psychology professor at the University of New York. His areas of research and all the popular books, he writes popular books too, has been writing on what he calls moral psychology, cultural differences. He's really big on why our culture is so divided. And he's trying to find out what is the psychology that makes us so divided, and he tries to bring people together. He's not ideological. He's a very practical kind of guy, which fits the ancient Near Eastern wise man point of view. So he does all that, but something really dramatic happened to him some years ago that made him turn his attention to what is happening to children. And this is where I kind of learned about him and kind of got involved listening to what he had to say, because there's a lot of wisdom in Jonathan Haidt's research. So what he found was there was a definite moment in time in our country when the rates of depression and anxiety among children and young people started soaring. And I mean soaring. He said it didn't increase. He called it a tidal wave. It was so noticeable in all the literature of what children and young people were going through. And it all happened right around 2012. So it was like, kind of going like that. And then boom, in 2012, anxiety and mental health issues among young people skyrocketed all of a sudden. So there was this deep dive into finding out why that happened, what changed things so drastically that made that happen. And so he just dove into all the research. That's what an ancient Near Eastern wise man does. He observes. So he's coming at this from an observational point of view. That's exactly the way they would have done it back in those days. So this tidal wave of poor mental health. So he dives into that 2012 year. What changed in this culture that made that happen in 2012? Social media and smartphones. That's when children were starting to be given smartphones all the time, and then social media became so prominent. That's exactly what it is. So ever since then, Jonathan Haidt's big focus has been the impact of technology on youth. So now he's kind of he's a big advocate for getting rid of screens in schools, for example. No smartphones all day in school. All day. You've got to pack them away. You can't even have them with you. And then minimizing the amount of time that's on screens, because everything's sort of being screen-oriented these days. So that's his big thing. So education, socialization, depression, and anxiety. He says it's been a disaster on all of those points ever since that big spike, that tidal wave of mental health issues. So he's been a big promoter, and with some success. Some schools are starting to get rid of phones. You can't have them all day long and that kind of a thing. So last year, he wrote a book called The Anxious Generation, How the Great Rewiring of Childhood is Causing an Epidemic of Mental Illness. That's the title. That sounds like a Puritan title. They're like really long. But it's well worth your time to look at that research he's done. So he says the phone-based childhood has led to social deprivation, sleep deprivation, and attention fragmentation, and addiction. And he talks about worldview as well. He says he's talking about worldview from a secular point of view, an observational point of view, because the research shows, and he's a big data guy, that many boys and girls today believe that their lives are meaningless. That's the word he uses, meaningless. That's like taking our current world and dropping it right into the book of Ecclesiastes. That's exactly what Solomon's talking about. This emptiness, this meaninglessness. So that's fascinating. So Haidt's work is all data-driven analysis. Like I said, that's what we would call observation. And that's exactly what ancient Near Eastern wise men did. So it fits the exact pattern. Truth being arrived at by careful observation. So his thinking is not based on moral absolutes. It's not based on the Bible or anything like that. It's just he's got a clear eye looking at what's actually going on in the world. So it's actually useful. Good observation is actually useful. It's wisdom. So he does see problems, and his observations have a lot to offer us to think about. So the last stuff I saw from him, Jonathan Haidt, the last time I really looked at his stuff, was psychological effects that are made possible by the smartphone, everybody having a smartphone, of the impact on children of social media, readily accessible pornography, and video games. And he said boys are being rewired, that's his language, by constant access to pornography and to video games, and girls are more harmed by social media stuff. That's his point. So my point is, a wise, biblically informed Christian would have a lot of the same concerns, the exact same concerns, as this secular academic guy who's just an honest observer. He's unhindered by a lot of modern ideology. He resists ideology. You know, our culture is very split, like on these ends, ideological ends, but he doesn't like that. So that he wants to be after Babel, talking seriously, communicating with each other, working together, that kind of a thing. But listen, wise men without God can offer us a lot of wise things, but their wisdom has severe limitations. That's what I'm saying today, and we see it exactly. That's where Solomon is. It's exactly where he is with his wise men of his day. So it's very, very similar. They have something to offer, especially if they're doing good observation, careful observation, but that only goes so far. Men like Jonathan Haidt can help us with their observations. They can talk about what works best on average. What's the thing that generally works best? And he says it would be best to not have that much screen time. That's what he's saying. Very simple. And we could all go, yeah, that makes perfect sense. But he can't answer the questions about meaning. He can say young people today are meaningless. They don't have meaning in their life. But what's he going to offer them? He doesn't really have a whole lot that he offers in place of that, except, old traditional family values and being together and all those kind of things, which is fine, but no ultimate purpose in life, or even an explanation about why things don't work. Why does corruption always sneak in to human endeavors and become the norm? Why is that? Why this tendency toward evil that we have to fight against so hard? Why aren't we just all good? And just go, hey, I shouldn't do that anymore. I'm going to cut down on my screen time and just stop doing it. Because we're glued, right? We are bent easily. And he says, I think it would be better if we do this or live like this. But in reality, the world doesn't cooperate. Why not? Why doesn't it all go, yeah, you're right. That's what the evidence shows. That's what we should do. We should just start doing that. The world at large has a very hard time with norms, moral norms, or even just what's beneficial. It has a very hard time doing that. So there's always also, along with that, this nagging hole in the heart that wants to be filled, that remains unfulfilled because we don't know our Creator, and He made our hearts to be lined up with Him. But if we reject that, or we're not taught that, or nobody ever tells us about that, we've got this hole in our heart. And then there's death. So Jonathan Haidt is a wise man, but he can't give you ultimate purpose. He can't give you meaning in life, nor can he even begin to tell you what happens when you die. He has no idea, right? If you remember last time, Solomon, speaking under the sun as a wise man without God, Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 2, this is what he said. This is under the sun thinking. It's the same for all. There is one fate for the righteous and for the wicked, for the good, for the clean, and the unclean, for the man who offers a sacrifice and for the one who does not sacrifice. As the good man is, so is the sinner. As the swearer is, so is the one who is afraid to swear. And then in verse 3 of chapter 9, he says, this is evil. This is an evil in all that is done under the sun, that there is one fate for all men. Furthermore, the hearts of the Son of Men are full of evil, and insanity is in their hearts throughout their lives. And afterward, they go to the dead. Now, that's an honest, observational view of everything. And that's what Solomon sees under the sun. And then we ended last time in verse 10 of chapter 9. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there's no activity or planning or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol. That's where the dead go. That's the grave, where you are going. So death is your end. under the sun, right? All activity, knowledge, wisdom, it's done. It's over. Because by observation, that's all you know. And if observation is your worldview about life, then it's done when you die. That's over. Everything's over. Now, the entire section from chapter 9, verse 10, where we just stopped there, through all the rest of chapter 9, and then including all of chapter 10, doesn't mention God once. So it's all going to be under the sun. And that's what we're looking at today. Okay, so just so you know where I am here. So when you see the words under the sun, all of it is under the sun thinking. It's all about now. Now is all you have. So live your life well. He's being an ancient Near Eastern wise man. These are my recommendations. This is how you can have a good life. When you die, it's over. So if you want to have a good life now, listen to what I have to say. Why would he put that in there? Why do that? Why so much? Why have such a long section without God even being mentioned? Because he's offering real wisdom. It's real insights. It's real good observation and good conclusions based on observation. And Solomon wants to bring these ancient Near Eastern wise men that see him as the wisest man around, he wants them to find out about God. He wants to bring God into it. So first he's giving them a lot of wisdom that they're going to go, yes, that's helpful. Yes, that's why you are wise. And then he's going to bring God in. He's not going to bring him in today. But stick around for next week because he's going to get there. But that's what he's doing. So this whole section today, this whole section, and a little bit next week too, it's going to be under the sun thinking. But it's real wisdom. So it does have value. But it doesn't have meaning. It doesn't add meaning. In fact, he kind of shows how it doesn't have meaning, okay? So again, he gives them wisdom they can agree with, that is insightful, just the way Jonathan Haidt is insightful and helpful. But then Solomon's going to be bringing God into the picture. So wisdom is still wisdom. It's just empty wisdom without God. So let's take a brisk walk through Solomon's wisdom together, and then we'll see how far we get today, and then we'll clean it up next week. So Solomon says you need to know something. So while you live for now and do life according to man's wisdom, the first thing he's got to say is none of it may work out. In other words, I've got a lot of wonderful suggestions I can make for how to live your life. I can show you how to live the good life, and it may not work out at all. Thank you. It might work out, might half work out, but it might not work out. So daily wisdom can be a complete failure. So verse 11, I again saw under the sun that the race is not to the swift, the battle is not to the warriors, neither is bread to the wise, nor wealth to the discerning, nor favor to men of ability, for time and chance overtake them all. So these are little maxims that we say to each other, and every civilization has these little sort of truths, we pass on to the next generation. Hey, the race is to the swift, right? Yeah, think about that. The battle is to the brave, right? If you're not brave, you can't win the battle. Bread is to the wise. If you're wise, you'll be earning a lot more than people that aren't wise. And wealth is to the discerning. You just go through all this kind of stuff. Wealth belongs to the discerning person, all of that. There's all kinds of things we say because we hope it's the case, and we don't want to say what indeed happens sometimes. Sometimes the slow cheat and they win the race. Sometimes the brave are betrayed and lose the battle. Sometimes the wise go hungry, and sometimes the wealth goes to the fool. Look at the music industry, for example. So time and chance and evil can overtake the most wise and the most able person, right? That's just true. I mean, we see it happen in life all the time. It's just the 20th century. In just the 20th century, so this is when we're technologically advanced and all of that. I looked this up just because I was curious about what the actual numbers were. Between 200 million people and 300 million people in the 20th century during that 100-year time, between 200 and 300 million people were killed by other human beings. That's a lot of people. If you take in wars, government oppression, like Stalin killed millions of people, Chairman Mao killed tens of millions of people, just murders alone, it's more than 200 million people, might be as much as 300 million people. None of those people that were murdered planned for that. That was not their life goal. That was not what they wanted to have happen. It just happened to them, whether they were good or bad, whether they were righteous or unrighteous, whether they were God-seeking or ungodly people. They got caught up in this giant maelstroms of evil. They were just taken, right? And that number does not include natural disasters, famines, plagues, all kinds of stuff like that, disease, all of that. That's just humans killing other human beings. And Solomon says, I have seen it happen. Calamities overtake us, and death lurks in the corners. So look at verse 12. Moreover, man does not know his time. Like fish caught in a treacherous net, and birds trapped in a snare, so the sons of men are ensnared at an evil time when it suddenly falls on them. You have no idea this is going to happen, and all of a sudden your government decides to kill millions of people, and you're one of them, right? Your family, whatever. Happens all the time, still happening all over the world. So some people get swept away like fish and sold into the marketplace, right? They're dead. Some escape. And who can say why? Why them and not this person? Why now and not later? Why over here and not over there? And it seems, even from observation, that we're far more in the hands of unknown forces and unknown circumstances than we have in our own hands. See, wisdom says, you've got your life in your own hands. You do this and it's going to be better for you. But all these unseen forces can rip all of that away at any time. So Solomon tells a little story in verse 13, a story about a very wise but also a very poor man. Verse 13. Also this I came to see as wisdom under the sun. See how he says that? It's under the sun wisdom, right? That this world is all there is. And it impressed me. There was a small city with a few men in it, and a great king came to it and surrounded it and constructed large siege works against it. But there was found in it a poor wise man, and he delivered the city by his wisdom. Somebody had an idea how to beat this thing, and it worked. This poor person wasn't one of the generals or the king or anything like that. Some poor guy said, if we do this, I think we can outlast this siege, or we can beat these guys. And it worked. Then he says, yet no one remembered that poor man. So I said, wisdom is better than strength, but the wisdom of the poor man is despised, and his words are not heeded. That's just an interesting little story to ponder. So the hero of the day, if he's not a significant person, is soon forgotten. That's what he's saying there. Why? Because he wasn't important. And that naturally made me think of Davy Crockett. Why did I think of Davy Crockett? Well, my daughter recently asked us to send her the DVD of the Disney Crockett thing, Davy Crockett, that whole thing. So we bought that, and we're sending it off to Japan. They're in Japan. You can't just get Davy Crockett there. So we're sending it off to her. But we had to watch it first just to make sure the discs are okay, DVDs. So anyway, Laura and I watched it again. But it reminded me that many decades ago, I had read to my children Davy Crockett's autobiography. He actually wrote an autobiography of himself, right? So we'd read that to the kids, and I remembered this section from it. So I looked it up again, and there's this kind of an amusing story he tells about his experience as a scout in General Jackson's army during the Creek Indian Wars. Okay, so he was a scout. So Davy comes back to camp after this extensive mission to report on the native hostile Indians, and he comes back to give a report. And he says, now I'm going to quote him, okay? About 10 o'clock in the morning, we reached the camp, and I reported to Colonel Coffee the news. He didn't seem to mind my report a bit. That doesn't mean he didn't mind. It meant he didn't pay any attention to it. That's mind, the way they used to use that word. He didn't pay any attention to my report a bit, and this raised my dander higher than ever. But I knowed I had to be on my best behavior, so I kept it all to myself. Though I was so mad that I was burning inside like a tar kiln. And I wondered that the smoke hadn't been pouring out of me at all points. Major Gibson hadn't yet returned, and we all began to think he was killed, and that night they put out a double guard. The next day, the major got in and brought a worse tale than I had, though he had stated the same facts so far as I went. This seemed to put the colonel all in a fidget, and it convinced me clearly one of the hateful ways of the world. When I made my report, I wasn't believed because I wasn't no officer. I was no great man, but just a poor soldier. But when the same thing was reported by Major Gibson, why, then it was all as true as preaching. And the colonel believed every word. So what's he call that? One of the hateful ways of the world. How a poor man is not listened to, even if he has really important things he can offer, right? So those that should be honored are not always honored. And it also happens to people who receive honors that they didn't necessarily deserve. So he's going to expand on that idea, not Davy Crockett, but Solomon is going to expand on that idea in chapter 10 here. So the principle of the story is expressed in the next verses. Verse 17 of chapter 9, the words of the wise heard in questions are better than the shouting of a ruler among fools. Wisdom is better than weapons of war, but one sinner destroys much good. So he's saying wisdom is better to be wise. It's objectively, truly, genuinely better to be wise. But it can all be overthrown really easily by one fool or one sinner, is the word he uses here. So the shouter usually gets his way. The quiet words of wisdom are often forgotten or ignored. And just one sinner can make a big mess. That's true in any circumstance in the history of nations. It's true in the life of churches. One sinner can make a very big mess. That's why Jesus gave us the privilege of excommunication, to take one sinner that's wrecking everything and put them out. But you have to be able to do that. But one person can cause all kinds of havoc and destruction in the world. Now, in chapter 10, we follow this same theme, wisdom contending with the madness and the foolishness of the world. And again, Solomon is super perceptive. He's just based on observation. This is all under the sun. He starts with a proverb, and he's kind of echoing the last thought of chapter 9, that one sinner can destroy much good. So chapter 10, verse 1, dead flies make a perfume's oil stink. So a little foolishness is weightier than wisdom and honor. In other words, if a dead fly, just a little fly, can make a whole batch of perfume stink, then one idiot can wreck all kinds of good things that are going on, that people are doing. That's what he's trying to say. So a little foolishness has more weight. It can destroy more than wisdom and honor. So it takes less to ruin something than it does to create something. It's easier to spoil things. It's very easy to do that. So in a fallen world, wisdom and honor always have an uphill climb, because it's always easy to break things and tear things down. So many years ago, we had a discussion group about, we all read, a bunch of us, remember Jack? We all read Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. We all got together and came over to my house. We read a chapter a week and talked about the chapter. Great book. And of course, he was the great missionary that opened China Inland Mission. Still honored there by the Chinese Christians, by the way. When I was there, they actually had a little hymn book, and on the back they had a picture of Hudson Taylor. So they remembered more than 100 years later what he brought to China. But anyway, the book explains how anti-Christian riots and mobs would be unleashed against Christian missionaries by lies from local leaders. And it's just like what's happening in India these days, what we've talked about here so many times. In one case, posters would be put up that said there were 24 missing children, likely eaten by missionaries. So just wild accusations, wild lies. And later, the posters would be put up that recommended specific actions that maybe we could take, such as subtle things like avenge our wrongs, attack, destroy, much loot shall be ours. Those kind of things to get people kind of riled up. So the deadly lie in the perfume, if you will, a simple lie with enormous consequences. That kind of thing happens all the time. Just like when we were talking about in India, they put up recently those big posters saying that they're eating our cows, right? The Christians are telling us to eat cows and we've got to kill them. So that kind of thing. So it's always interesting how stories and events can be spun in certain directions, and that's how the world runs in so many spheres. A carefully placed lie can change all kinds of things and all kinds of behaviors. Then verse 2 points out that wisdom and folly often go in opposite directions. I just got to say before I read verse 2, this is not a political statement. Solomon did not know about current politics. A wise man's heart directs him toward the right, but the foolish man's heart directs him toward the left. Not saying anything else about that. So left and right, just like in many cultures, were always a designation for what's wrong and what's right? Like the left is wicked, the right is good. You know the word sinister? That's the Latin word for left. That's where it comes from, the Latin word for left. So treating people who are left-handed, remember how that used to be? They were treated with suspicion, like they were defective. They beat them to make them force them to write with their right hand. And language is sort of tied to that superstitious view of left-handedness and that kind of a thing. So the saying here suggests that a fool's heart moves him into a less valuable, less virtuous way, to the left. And so that's the only point he's making there. So now, verse 3 is not an endorsement of the American system of driving on the right side of the road. That's not a moral issue. But look at verse 3. Even when the fool walks along the road, his sense is lacking, and he demonstrates to everyone that he is a fool. So this is observation, again. What does it mean? He's saying you can often see a fool's foolishness because it's so obvious. You just watch his behavior. He's walking along the road and you can tell he's a fool. What's he doing? He's kicking over yard signs or what? Some kind of wandering in the middle of traffic, that kind of stuff. You can tell he's a fool. A fool can't conceal his folly for very long. That's sort of the message there. It comes out in some way. Then verse 4 might be advice for men in court of the king, much like chapter 9 was about that. It's advice for dealing with the temperamental king or the ruler or your boss. If the ruler's temper rises against you, do not abandon your position because composure allays great offenses. That's how my New American Standard translates it. In other words, don't be too quick to leave or resign just because you get yelled at by a surly, volcanic king or boss or ruler or something like that. Just be calm, keep your composure, that idea. Foolishness or rashness are not uncommon in high places, so Solomon's just saying, just keep it still, keep your head, keep your composure. Like they say in West Side Story, keep cool, boy. Or if things are really rough, keep coolly cool, boy. And, now that whole song is in my head. But you know what all this is we've been looking at here? So all of this stuff we've just been talking about, it's just good advice. Yeah. It's just good advice. It's wisdom. That's all it is. It's good advice. All these things are examples of Solomon's wisdom, his insights into human frailty and weakness and ways to respond to this messy world with a little bit of direction and some good advice. But none of it is saving. None of it is saving. None of these things bring you to God, right? This is under the sun thinking. Best advice based on what I can see. So it's advice for a believer or an unbeliever because it's just good advice, generally speaking. They're just good suggestions to navigate life. But he's got a lot more in mind here. He's going somewhere with all this. He's leading wise men to seek God. That's where he's going, but not yet. Okay? So the good advice is to get their attention. Get their attention, to benefit them with common daily wisdom so he can get them to think about the big questions. He's already done that with death. Is death really it? It's because observation says it's over. Is that right? He's already got them thinking about those kind of things. So this morning we began talking about Jonathan Haidt and a modern wise man, a man who doesn't know the Creator, has no relationship with God, who has no ultimate reference point. He just has observation. That's all he's got. He's a good guy. I mean, he even seems like a nice guy when you listen to him talk and stuff like that. But he is, as Jesus would call him, lost. He's lost because he's lost to God and he doesn't know him. But he speaks truth as much as he is able to see it by observation. But a lost man in a fallen world without God is extremely limited in his vision. He can only tell you so much. He can only help you so far because his vision is very limited. It's really interesting, an issue for a man like Jonathan Haidt. So I was really interested in his view of the trans ideology. And again, he's not an ideological person. He kind of is very suspicious of ideologies. So I was kind of curious what his view was on that. Well, I've never heard him say that biology is reality and genetics are determinative. I've never heard that. But he does live by careful observation, and he agrees that there's something, he says there's something like gender dysphoria. That's a real thing. He says but he thinks transitioning is mostly not a good thing. He says it might help some people, that's what he's saying, but he's too honest not to point out that there's abundant evidence that many of those who are transitioning from one gender to another are being affected by social media. They call it a social contagion because there's groups that all of a sudden all want to transition together, especially girls. And it's part of the anxiety generation, what he calls the anxiety generation. They're adrift. They don't have meaning. And they're majorly influenced by social media. And there's people who live on social media to try to get you to start thinking that way about transitioning. There's people that push you to do that, encourage you to do that, motivate you to do that. And they're grasping at something to explain. They find people that are grasping at something to explain the anxiety that they have. And they also want to be on the cutting edge of attention, because the social media world is all about being honored and getting attention and having people pay attention to you and give you likes and praise and all that kind of stuff. And what braver thing can you do, or more attention-getting thing can you do than transition? That's a cutting edge thing to do. It's a cool thing to do, and it brings you a lot of attention. So men like Jonathan Haidt can't offer much help to deliver people from that, but he can point it out. So that's what he does. He points it out. He's saying young people that are told they were assigned the wrong gender at birth are probably wrong. And there's all kinds of evidence to show that. But at best, all he can do is say, be cautious, be careful. Don't go too far with this. Think about it very carefully. Now, let me offer you one example of God's power intervening in those kind of situations. So for a while, I've followed this very brave young lady, and I've kept up with her kind of off and on for several years. Her name is Chloe Cole. You may have seen her on television or some of the things like that. She testified before Congress. Chloe just turned 21 years old this week. And like lots of girls, when she was young, she felt uncomfortable about her body. She was kind of a tomboy and all of that. So somebody got a hold of her and started feeding her trans ideology. You're a boy. You're supposed to be a boy. And they convinced her that that was the case. She's supposed to be a boy. So her parents took her to a Kaiser pediatrician when she was 12. And of course, her parents were told the standard lie. They said, well, if you don't help her transition, you might have a dead daughter instead of a live son. So maybe you should go ahead and let her do that, so you'll have a live son instead of a dead daughter. That's a very common thing that the parents are told. So at 13 years old, they put her on Lupron, which is a puberty blocker. And then a month later, after starting that, they started testosterone injections into this girl. She's a girl. She's 13 years old. And they give her testosterone for 2 years. So when she's 15, then they surgically remove her breasts from her body. And voila, guess what? They tell her, you're a boy now. You're a boy. Well, a year after that, when she's 16 years old, she's in a health class in high school, and they're talking about giving birth, and they're talking about breastfeeding. And she suddenly realizes that she can never breastfeed because they took that away from her. And she starts to reject the whole idea of transitioning. After all of that was done to her body, when they gave her testosterone, she started getting a deep voice and masculine features, and all of these things were happening to her. And now suddenly she realizes the whole thing was not what she wants. And it's going to keep her from even being a full woman, right, for the rest of her life. So long story short, she decided to be a girl again, as difficult as that would be. And she's been an outspoken advocate for detransitioners. And like I said, she even testified before Congress. But I thought I would give you just the latest thing she wrote. I'm going to read the whole thing. This is what she wrote on her birthday just a few days ago. I'm quoting. Is feeling like you're running out of time in your late teens and early 20s just a normal part of growing up? Since turning 16, most of my birthdays were followed by an existential crisis. But my 21st was different. Peaceful. No dread at all. The shift came from maturing over time and finding my purpose. I drifted through adolescence without a moral or spiritual foundation, feeling directionless after high school. Then, God-fearing people around me offered help, gave me a voice, and guided me toward Christ, the missing piece of my puzzle. I've been transforming emotionally, physically, and spiritually ever since. I'm still flawed, but the old me is unrecognizable. I see much of my generation in her, talking about her old self. This unshakable anxiety seems universal amongst my peers from school, college, and protests, especially those without a spiritual foundation. Gen Z's identity crisis has a clear antidote, unquote. That's how she ends it. Gen Z's identity crisis has a clear antidote. What's the clear antidote? It's the antidote to the question of who I am and why I am here in the world, and the antidote is Christ. I'm a creature of God, made according to his specifications. I live in a fallen world full of imperfections. I am imperfect myself morally. I need mercy. I need grace. Any of us should be able to say this. I live in a fallen world, and I need grace from God. I need acceptance from God. And God entered this world in the person of Jesus of Nazareth to speak the truth and to call us home to him and to make reconciliation with him possible. And she found that. And now she wants that for other people. Jesus said, come to me all who labor and are what? Heavy laden, right? And I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Learn from me. For I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light. And that's a call to everyone. Boomers, too. Boomers through Gen Z and everybody else. That's for everyone. So how does he give us rest? He solves our sin problem by taking the burden of our sin upon himself. That's how he gives us rest. We don't have to fear God. He reconciles us to God. Through God's Son, the Lord has brought us into his kingdom. Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, it says, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us, that's a trans word, he's transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. And so because of Jesus, we're accepted. We're accepted by God. And we can have peace in our hearts because we're at peace with God, our Creator and our Judge. But our Judge looks at us and says, you're okay because my Son took care of your whole sin issue. And I welcome you as my child. Nothing can be better than that. Nothing can be better than that. Let's pray. Our merciful Father, how deceived we can be, how lost we can be, how far from you we can roam away. We can go off in deep places, dark places. But in your great love, you seek us. You come to the rescue. You speak truth. You sent Jesus to atone for our sins. You cover the cost of our deliverance. You set us on the narrow path to life. And we owe you so much. And all you ask is that we give you our hearts, give you our trust, give you our faith. You give us eternal joy in return, and we shall eternally sing your praise. We declare this in Jesus' name. Amen.